Our special guest today is Daisy Auger-Dominguez, who is an accomplished executive and dynamic leader widely recognized for her ability to lead organizational transformations on the leading edge of people and culture. A natural storyteller and team builder with a purpose driven mindset, Daisy launched her career at Moody's. She's held leadership roles at the Walt Disney Company, Google, Time Warner, and Viacom. Most recently, she served as Global Chief People Officer at Vice Media, and she founded Auger-Dominguez Ventures, a workplace strategy consultancy. Daisy authored Inclusion Revolution and it has a new book releasing September 18th titled From Burned Out to Lit Up: How to Reignite the Joy of Leading People. She has been featured in publications like Harvard Business Review and has contributions that have earned her prestigious honors and recognition. What I appreciate most about you, Daisy, is your light. Thank you for sharing it with us, and welcome to your second interview at R.O.G.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Shannon. I'm thrilled to be here.
I'm so excited to reconnect and learn more about your book. You were in the midst of writing it when we
Mhm.
did our first interview, ROG episode 156, which was titled Leading with Humanity: Guide to Modern Management. And in that interview, you share a bit about your background. So I'll just
Mhm.
ask our listeners to re listen to that to learn a little bit more about you. In this episode, I really want us to dive right into your wisdom and guidance on burnout. So, what led you to write this book, Daisy?
Oh, goodness. My own burnout. It was not just witnessing my own burnout, but the collective burnout of the teams that I led, my colleagues, my friends. I last summer, I like to say that I wasn't just burnt out; I was burnt crispy. Right, I had nothing left. I had gone, like many of us, through what seemed like an endless health crisis, and leading teams globally, going through reductions in force and a bankruptcy and very public corporate events that were playing out in the media mainstream, but that you know we still needed to hold space, emotional space, for so many humans that were going through so much, and in the organizations where I was working. And I had lost that light you talked about at the beginning when you were introducing me, right? I just was
Mm,
putting one foot in front of the other and getting through. And I had the benefit and the privilege of working with an executive coach, R.O.G, of having a husband who is a wonderful mirror, and would call me on the days when I just wasn't showing up as myself, right?
mhm,
For him, for our daughter.
mhm,
um, and I had just moments and moments of saying, this is not me, this is not how I want to live, but it's also not how I want to lead.
mm,
Because, and you and I have talked about leading with humanity. I really do fundamentally believe that leadership, leading, is a calling.
mhm,
And I lost that love for it for a bit. And so as I did some work trying to rebuild myself and trying to find myself again, I realized that I wanted to share that story, and I wanted to share it because I realized that it wasn't just my story, that it was a collective experience that we were not talking about enough, that we were
mm,
not sharing with each other, and that the lonelier it is, the more you burn out, right? The more
mhm.
exhausting it is. So I wanted to make it a little less lonely, and I wanted to share what I had learned.
Thank you for doing that. I mean, I think it's a true sign of a generous leader to take your pain as you're experiencing it and think about how that could benefit other people. I mean, that's really like what a generous leader does is thinks, what is going on and how might I be of service? So even in the midst of all of that, you thought, let me find a way to share this. Like not everyone will get the opportunity to meet you one on one, but
Mhm.
they'll get to listen to podcasts, they'll get to read your books, they'll get to read your articles and learn. So I thank you for the generous act of writing that because I know how difficult that is. So your new book has four parts. Part
Yes.
one is recognizing the fires.
Mhm.
Part two is navigating the flames.
Yes.
Part three is leading through the an inferno. And then part four is beyond burnout. So in your opening chapter, and thank you for the advanced copy so that I could be prepared for this conversation today. It's amazing.
Okay.
In that opening chapter, it's called Where There's Smoke, There's Fire. You talk about recognizing the signs of burnout.
Mhm.
So, what do you want readers to recognize? And you also explain what it is and what it isn't. So, could you
Yes.
please explain?
Yeah, you've got to start with the basics, right? And I think that in today's day and age with all the social media around us and all the cute memes and right, we use all these words and they stop losing meaning. And so I wanted to ground the reader on what burnout is. And and I always like to um ground, and I do this with my daughter, and in my own conversations, was like, what is something? I was like, well, let me explain to you what it isn't, right? Because you may be thinking it is that. And so what it isn't is the day-to-day tensions that we experience at work, right? And the mishaps that happen. So your Wi-Fi is not working, right? Your commute was terrible. Your colleagues, are not delivering what they're supposed to be delivering. It's like all of that is the day-to-day tensions and and mishaps of working with humans, right? Of working with people. And I should say that I love talking about work, and I love doing the work of work, because I fundamentally believe that we go to workplaces to do the things that we can't do by ourselves, right? We
Mhm.
go to workplaces because we want to work with other people, right? We love to complain about the other people, right? But we love to work in collaboration because we want to create things that are bigger than us, that will have an impact. And what I can create with you is a whole lot better than I can create by myself. Right? Like that, I just fundamentally believe that. But to do that, right, there's just interpersonal tensions that exist, and there is, and there are differences of opinion. That's not burnout. That's just, those are daily annoyances, right? That we put up with. Burnout is that excessive and sustained workload, right? That, and it's been defined by the World Health Organization, right? This is a disease, right? This isn't just this cute term that we think
Feeling.
just
Yeah.
just existed, right? So I walked through those definitions, and researchers that I have been doing extensive um, research on this topic, and it's that sustained stress that causes dysfunction and malfunction, not just in your daily operations, but also internally in your body and in your psyche. I define burnout as, as a tricky monster, right? And it's kind of that
Mhm.
uninvited guest that just like keeps on staying and will not go.
Mhm.
Um, and I talk also about an interview that I had with Kate Donovan, who is um, uh, she has her podcast is Fried, the Burnout podcast, right? And she's an expert on burnout, and she talks about how burnout is just, it's just this this constant deterioration of all of
Mhm.
our functions, right? And that really hit me when she said that, because I had experienced that. My burnout story was physical, emotional, and spiritual, right? I had all sorts of physical conditions that nobody could tell me what they were, right? But I felt sluggish, I was bloated, I had, my entire body was full of rashes. I would get these,
Mm.
my eyes would it looked like my husband had beat me up, right? Like they were, I would just wake up with these
Mm.
conditions that, because I had asthma, and I had a lot of, sort of conditions throughout my life, I always just assumed, if I wake up sick, I'm like, that's what happens, right? But it was this constant state of being sick, and this constant state of
Mm.
just all of my functions not functioning anymore, right? And so that was that burnout. And when I spoke to Kate, I asked her, Kate, how do we avoid this, right? Now that I know what burnout isn't and what it
Mhm.
is, right, which is, this sustained stress due to excessive workloads and excessive stressors that
Mhm.
exist in your day to day, how do I avoid it? And Shannon, her answer just like always rings in my ear. She said, was like, that's the tricky thing. People like you and I, we're most prone to burnout, right? Overachievers, um, people who have these narratives in their heads of hustling and the grind and the doing and doing, we're most prone to burnout because we see the signals. We're smart enough to see what the signals are, but we just push them aside.
Mhm.
Not today, right? I was like, I'm going to answer those next 15 emails that I have and not take the break that I need right now and then go straight to my other meetings instead of taking the 15 minutes that I could have taken to rest and replenish. I'm going to go to bed an hour later, finishing that project that I could possibly, finish earlier tomorrow morning if I have a good night's sleep, but I'm just going to power through and do it. And then I'm going to wake up sluggish and tired and exhausted, and I'm going to be giving less, right? Or I don't know how many times you have said this. I know I have. It's like, I'll rest over the weekend, right? I'm just like, like, let me just get through. And it's just like, and then the weekend comes, and then you have to take care of life, right? All the
Yep.
things that come up,
Yep.
and you look behind you, and you're like, what? When was I able to replenish my social battery? That's what my daughter calls her battery, her
Mhm.
social battery. It was like,
Mhm.
when did I replenish my battery? I didn't. So I wanted to, in that chapter, to talk about what that looks like from a work setting, in terms of workloads, in terms of boundary setting, right? All of these elements.
Mhm.
That's what the first chapter is about. It's grounding you on what it is, what it isn't, and then moving on to the next chapters, as you mentioned.
Mm, so helpful. Thank you for that. And I think it's really relatable. And especially as, all of us and our listeners are generous leaders, that's a symptom of generous leadership too. If we're not also being generous to ourselves, right? If we're only being of service and we're only, exceeding expectations and getting things done ahead of deadline and just taking things on and saying yes, like that, there's a consequence to doing
Mhm.
that, to a point where you're beyond your own boundaries. Like I read in one of your books about how someone said that they were going to give you another team to
Yeah,
manage, and you were like, I can barely manage the team I have,
yeah,
like just that, like, "Rrr," and then you have that thing in your head that you're like, well, maybe I could, and maybe
yeah.
I should, and maybe and so we get into this like illusion of just being more than one human being. And I
Hmm.
think that's a dangerous illusion for us to have.
It is, and it's also, you know, it's systemic, right? This isn't just something that we made up, right? We've been
Mhm,
told. I don't know about you, but when I started my career, all of the things that we say yes to are the things that we have been told that we're supposed to say yes to, right? The
mhm,
extra hours of work, the extra teams to take on, the extra
mhm,
labor. I was like, that's how you advance in the workplace. That's how you show your worth, right? And we've never been told, especially as women, right, that we can sit proudly and affirm our worth without having to overwork ourselves, right?
mhm,
We can still deliver and perform highly, right? Because this is about high performance. And for those of us who are high performance leaders, we just think that it's about working more, or,
grinding.
like the misnomer was like working smarter, right? All of these things. I was like, well, it's fundamentally is about being able to know where your boundaries sit, what
Mhm,
what they are, and being able to speak to them thoughtfully and credibly and respectfully and with situational awareness, without having to like lean into those old narratives of the only way I can prove my worth is by working myself to the bone.
mm, yes, and in your book, you have this whole series of problems and then try this solutions, which you
Yeah.
offer to us. So with that problem
Mhm.
of saying yes to everything and thinking that you can't say no, what would be your try this type of a solution?
Yeah, I mean, I share a few examples in the book, and one of them is, I don't know, I don't know about you, but I would get invited to every meeting at work. There was just this expectation that like you need to be at every meeting, and I just got into the habit of pausing, and I do it. We all have our styles, right? And so my style is cheeky. My style is direct, but light and kind. And so I would just pause and say, I was like, am I really the best person to be in that meeting? Perhaps you need a subject matter expert instead of me. What's the value that I'm going to add to the meeting? And then, and I would kind of just look at the person cheekily, and they would pause, right? And it's a moment for that pause and reflection to really think about what's the proper what I could say is like, what is the proper design for this meeting and who should be there and what's the racy model, right? But you don't
Yeah,
want to shame people,
yeah,
right? It's not
yeah.
about hurting them. So for me, it's about using a little humor and just, but
Mhm,
inserting that moment of pause of, is this the right design? Is this the right construct for the people that should be there?
mhm,
And it is a way of affirming my my value and my time and energy as well. Because if I don't need to be in that 30-minute meeting, because I'm really not going to add more value than just being there physically and making other people feel comfortable that a leader is there or whatnot,
Mhm.
I can use that time differently, right? I could
Mhm.
use that time to walk around and just process something. I could use that time to answer emails, right? I could use that time
Mhm.
in a way that that allows me to safeguard my energy and what I contribute so that the next meeting I go to, I am better set up to actually contribute meaningfully, right?
Mhm.
Versus just being somewhere where what am I going to be? Angry that I'm there, maybe say two things and just be performative and then walk away, right? It's moving away from those pieces. And for me, I learned that through my own team, right? I
Mm.
learned that by going to meetings where I would be angry because I'm like, what am I doing here? My team would be angry because they would tell us like, well, why are you here? I can answer that question, right? We talk about growth in organizations. We talk about developing our teams. It's like that's how you develop your teams by
Empower
creating
them.
spaces for them to be, yes, empowered, for them to be able to show their expertise. But if my team member is being invited to the same meeting as me, they're then having to think, right? This cognitive load of like, do I speak instead of Daisy? Do I say something? I'm like, no, like I don't need to be there. You're the subject matter expert. By the
Mhm.
way, what I say is really what you told me to say anyway. Right? So
Right,
why do
because
you
you're
have
the one
to?
closest to the action. Yeah,
Yes, yes. So I
absolutely, and I
learned that
think
through them.
yes, and I think another thing that happens is that we attend those meetings. We know we don't really need to be there, so then we're multitasking. So
Ugh,
then the person who's leading the meeting thinks that they're being disrespected because they are, because we're not engaged. So I
mhm.
think it's just like there's a ripple effect of unnecessary obligation that people feel, and
Yes.
then there's hurt and shame and disrespect that no one intends to portray.
Mhm.
But that's really what you're saying is instead of establishing that boundary, clarifying who should be there and who's
Yeah.
got the authority,
Mhm.
try to do it all, and I think that's a grave mistake.
And we do it also because we think that that's what leading is, right? We've
Hmm.
created this misconstrued version of what leading is, and it's kind of like just being present, just being physically there. I'm like, no, I mean, presence is different, right? My presence, I don't have to be there physically for my team to know that I have their back. That
Hmm.
if they mess up in a meeting, they can text me, they can check in with me, they can come back to me afterwards and say, Daisy, like this happened. I'm like, okay, well, how would we problem solve that? What would we do, right? But I know I learned by making those mistakes. I know I
Hmm.
learned by being in meetings where I was just like, oh, okay, like, oh, I'm the one, right? I'm the one everyone's looking at. I'm the one that has to answer this. That's how we learn. That's how we grow. And if we want to create workplaces, as I believe we do, and I very much want to, places of joy and productivity and growth, right? Where dynamism thrives, right? We want to create those
Hmm.
workplaces, then we have to ensure that we are creating the spaces for everyone to flow in a healthy way. And meetings are a place that suck time and energy. It is also and I see this all the time, and I love the work that I do, and but I'm never in a place where I'm not solving for problems, right? Because that's my husband says, he's like, you're the fixer. You like to do that. I was like, yeah, I do. But a lot of the problems that emerge in organizations are interpersonal, right? It is that you and I had a disagreement over something, and now we're carrying that, and then our teams feel the weight of that. We feel the weight of that. And so, another element that I think reduces our burnout, and I share that in the book, and in some of the scripts that I share. I provide scripts because sometimes we actually need the help of how do I talk to somebody, right? How do
Mm.
I say the things that I want to say? And sometimes we just need someone to help us, either coach us or be a mediator to be able to say, hey, Shannon, when you said that in that meeting, I don't think that's what you meant, but it hurt my feelings.
Mhm.
Or I felt belittled, or right, whatever those things are, doing it in a way that's constructive so you can get it out of the way and not have that
Mhm.
chip at you for the rest of the day or even months to come.
Yes. Oh my gosh, there's so much in what you just said that I want to circle back on. So we're going to come back to joy. But now that you're talking about scripts, I
Yeah.
think that is one of the most powerful things in your book because very often we intellectually understand what an author or a thought leader is sharing with us, but it's like then but like, what do I do? What would this sound like? How would I respond to that? And I found that a lot of all of them really, scripts or ways, and of course, you're suggesting people say it in their own words,
Yes.
but you're giving them guidelines. They're very generous. And one of them is about teams, like the things that you could say on a team. And I wrote down this one. It says, "Thank you for acknowledging the operational mishap and working towards a solution. Your transparency is valued."
Mhm.
Right? Tell us more about that. Tell like why you wrote the scripts, or that even that one in particular, where you're acknowledging that yeah, something went wrong.
Mhm.
I appreciate your transparency rather than being resentful and
Yes,
irritated
yes.
that someone's calling me out. More like, thank you for making me aware. I mean, that's a shift.
It is, and I, I, I'll start with the scripts piece because as an HR leader, we spend a lot of time writing scripts for people. And sometimes, and sometimes I would joke like, when did people, forget how to talk to each other? But it's hard, right? It's
It
hard
is.
when you're caught in emotion,
Yeah.
um, when you're worried about saying the wrong thing, right? We live in a cancel culture, and so a lot of people are worried. I was like, if I say this, I'm going to be canceled, and or I'm going to say something, and HR is going to get me. I'm going to be in trouble with HR. So we spend all the time scripting notes for managers and leaders in particular, but sometimes for team members themselves to figure out how to navigate difficult conversations and difficult moments. And I wanted to provide those tips and tools also because I operate from a script making world because like many people, I tend to, sort of like I can get very emotional and very impatient in what I want to say. And so
Yep.
I've taught myself to write the things before I say them. Right. So
Hmm.
I live, I live in a world of writing things, and then that helps me process and helps me kind of just create a pause. So I wrote the scripts for those two reasons. One, because sometimes we just need a few tips and guidance on how to say some things and then put them in our own words. And two, because script writing, right? Like it adds an intentionality and a
Hmm.
purpose to how we engage with each other. And sometimes we forget that engaging with people, right? Like
Hmm.
interacting with people instead of transacting with people, right? Requires that level of thought. We spend a lot of time in transactional relationships all day long. I need you to do this. I'm going to do this, right? Instead
Hmm.
of, hey, Shannon, right? This is how I'm feeling about this. This is, this is how I'd like to see this. What do you think about this, right? That true relational piece. And that communication sometimes needs a little, you need a little, you need a little juice from a
Yeah, for
support.
sure.
And then that
Absolutely.
that particular sentence and script that you note, it's about being able to acknowledge what is happening in the moment so that people feel seen, heard, and valued, right? And sometimes in the moment
Mhm.
when you're giving critique, your first reaction is to take, I know my first reaction is to make myself as small as possible. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm the worst person in the world. I can't believe it. Like this just happened. And I've had to teach myself to reflect and to reflect to the person that is speaking to me. I am hearing you, right? The words
Yes.
you just said, the time, the energy, the courage that it
Mm.
just took for you to say the things you just said. I want to acknowledge that. And then I want to create a little room for me to reflect on it. Right. So that's the moment of thank you for acknowledging this. I want
Mhm.
to, I want to acknowledge, right, that there's a level of transparency and sometimes that there's courage, right? Use the words. And I was like, and then I'm going to ask you for a little grace so that I can think through
Mhm.
this and get back to you with an equally thoughtful response, right?
Mhm.
We don't do that, right? We go into the deepest recesses of our selves and we go in sometimes into like, I call it my little daisy, right? I go into like the hurt little daisy that just
Yep.
wants to react to that and make myself, for me, it's about making myself small so that nobody sees me because I don't want to get hurt anymore. Right.
Mhm.
And I have to remind myself, I am Daisy, you're a 51-year-old woman, right? With tremendous positional privilege, right? With a responsibility to model to others how do you actually do this thing that we call
Yeah.
working with others. I was like, put yourself together. It's like, and
Mhm.
show
Mhm.
care and show thought and show intention to the person that you're talking to.
Mm. Brilliant. Thank you. And those are really helpful. I'm also a script writer when I'm my best self. I can't say I always do that, but when I do it, it's funny because I recognize like, oh, that's passive aggressive, or
Yes.
that is blaming and shaming. And, like I think I'm being fair in my analysis or response. And then I think, let me just read this tomorrow. And then I'll read it the next day and think, oh my gosh, thank God I didn't send this, because it had fiery words in there that I didn't intend, like I didn't know were there because I was in the heat of the moment. It's like I just was in my small self at the time. And then you do talk about avoiding self-righteousness, and I want to
Oh,
circle back to that
yeah.
because that's so key, because that's really what's going on there, right? We're getting that trigger and feeling like we have to
Um,
defend
and that,
ourselves.
and then I'm right, right? And
And I'm right, and why do I even have to respond to this? This is so,
totally. How
not a
dare
good use
you?
of my
Like,
time. Yeah, how
you know,
dare you?
I'm your
Yeah.
boss. Like, why would you push that on me?
Yes.
Yes, no, and I think your point around we do this when we are our best selves. Um, that's also why I offer the scripts, because we're not always our best selves. So
Mhm.
by getting into the practice of writing scripts, we actually push ourselves to be our best selves, right?
Yeah.
It is about
Yeah.
that intentionality of knowing that I don't always show up as my best self, but my intent is to do so. And so when
Mhm.
I see, right, when I feel my body contracting, when I feel my breath getting shorter, right, that's a signal for me to just pause.
Yep.
Right. I was just
Yep.
like, this is not the time for me to say something.
Mhm.
This is
Yeah.
it's not gonna come out right. So it's like, so what are the tools that I have at my disposal to create that pause? And that's where the scripts come in.
So helpful. So going back to joy, you recently published an article in the Harvard Business Review, as you have done many times, and it was just recently on August 22nd, and it's called Finding Joy as a Manager Even on Bad Days. It's
Mhm.
really good. And in there you talk about strategies for reconnecting with joy at work. And I just love that that's a passion project for you, to help us to figure out how to find more joy at work, how to find more fulfillment in the things that we spend so much of our time dedicated to. So, could you speak a little bit about, like, why do you believe that that's so necessary, and even some of the things that you wrote about, like finding your why and embracing your beginner mindset?
Oh my gosh, sure. Well, I mean, to me, joy is, it's what keeps our energy tanks going, right? It's, in the toughest moments, in the challenging moments, in the murky and weird, right? We live in mind bending times, super messy times.
Mm,
My joy is what helps me recenter, right? It's what helps me come back to, and I'm like, oh, okay, like what,
yeah,
it's gonna
this is
be
what I'm.
okay. I've seen this movie play out before,
Yeah,
and I'm going to seek what is joyful about this. And in the article that I wrote for HBR, I focus and I share four of the practices that I share throughout Burnt Out to Lit Up. And and I always start with reflection as the first element, because that level of self-awareness, and we were just talking about that right now, Shannon, of being able to determine the why.
hmm,
And so I lean on, it's a Japanese term, your ikigai, right? What is it?
love
What is
it.
it that, right? Like, what is it that brings you joy? What is it that you're particularly good at? And what does the world need from you? And in
Mm,
moments of depletion and exhaustion, right? In moments of burnout, we forget who we are, right? Last year I took a radical sabbatical, and when I wrote about why I was taking a radical sabbatical, everybody was asking me, why are you doing it? And it was like everyone's leaving their jobs and whatnot. And I was very clear. I need to come back to myself.
mhm,
And I
mhm.
know that I can't do that while working 24/7. I need to find myself. I needed to find my ikigai again. And my ikigai, as I wrote this book, which was really, quite frankly, a healing journey for me. My
Mm.
book coach, Bethany Saltman, used to tell me that for some of her clients, she has to really pull words out, and with me, it was like, say less, right? Because it was coming out of me, it was pouring out of me, and
Ah,
it was that healing journey, and it was recognizing, for me, I was like, this is what I'm on this earth to do, is to share these stories, right? And it's to share
mhm.
my light, because we all have a bright light, and sometimes it gets dimmed for so many reasons. So getting to your ikigai and reminding yourself, because what happens when you're exhausted and you're depleted is that you forget all the goodness about you. right? You just get
Mhm.
caught in these cycles of like the world is awful and I am awful and I can't put one foot in front of the other and I can't get this, and we forget. And so that practice is about when in those moments, that's exactly when you need to pause and
Mm.
remind yourself of your awesomeness. Remind yourself of all the good that is within you, right? And what
Mhm.
is your purpose in this world? And purpose is like this big word, and I know that people feel like it's very woo woo, right? All these things, but we all have a reason to be here, right? Then we are, and even if it's just not a reason to be here, we all have a desire to do something, right? And we
Mhm.
just have to spend some time trying to think about what does that look like. And for some of us, is to write books and speak publicly. For others, my daughter does not want to speak publicly. That's not her. That's not her world, right? She loves animals. She nurtures animals. That is her. That could be her ikigai as she grows up. That could
Sure.
be her sense of becoming. So that's one of the practices. The second one, and it's the one that's getting the most attention from readers right now. It's sprinkling gratitude and joy like confetti. And I think that comes. That's so aligned with your podcast,
Oh,
Shannon.
yeah, for
And
sure.
I use the confetti metaphor came from a colleague of mine at I sat on the board of Planned Parenthood Federation of America, and Manish Goyal introduced this concept of confetti to us when we were building our DEI initiatives and trying to figure out how to build more cohesiveness as a board. And he had done this in previous ventures. He's a founder, entrepreneur, and he said, "Well, let's do confetti." And it's basically before every meeting, we would all send something we were proud of, and it's like my daughter's graduation. My son just had a daughter. I went on a world vacation. Whatever is those, we would share those, and it was a way of humanizing each other and getting to know
Mm.
each other beyond the transactional nature of our board interactions. And it is one of my favorite activities that we've done. I have borrowed it elsewhere. And I just think that being intentional about sprinkling that gratitude and that joy, right? Recognizing and celebrating the contributions, not just of the loudest people, but
Mm-mm.
specifically of those whose contributions often go unseen, but
Mhm.
sometimes they are the most important contributions on teams, right? The people that are holding things together, they're usually the ones that most people don't know they're doing all the things to hold things together. How about
Mhm.
showing them some love, right? And then also, how about showing yourself some love? So that those are two of the practices that I share.
Incredible. And there'll be a link to that article in the show notes. Everyone has to read it. It's so, so good. And like you said, it's like a summarized version of your new book. So it's a way for us to get a flavor of it. So one of the things that you talk about in your book repeatedly is around mantras and affirmations. And one of the things you write is affirmations to avoid self-righteousness.
Yes.
These are really important. Tell me like how this came to you, and like what are some of your favorites?
Oh goodness. Well, the self-righteousness came to me through a series of experiences at work where I realized that, all I was doing was trying to prove myself right instead of getting to the right answer and solution. And we actually not only spend so much time um, in those spaces, but we ruin our relationships, and we ruin our capacity to build bridges across each other when we don't see each other as the humans that we are, right? As the colleagues and partners that we are. So the avoiding self righteousness came from uh, a research piece that some research that I read from Dr. Audrey Tang, and she uses this technique called "just like me," right? Like, how do we, when we're in moments, how do we, try to push away from self righteousness and actually humanize the other person by reminding ourselves that just like me, they may be having a hard time. Just like me, you know, people may let you down even when they don't want to, right? Just, like these things happen, and it doesn't have anything to
Mhm.
do with you. And so those mantras that I share in the book, and specifically around just like me, right? Other people might let you down even when they don't want to. Like, just
Mhm.
remember that instead of going into like whenever people let me down, that means that they don't respect me, they don't value me. I am, I have, I have been hearing this recently. I have a bullseye on me. Any day I can get fired, and I'm just like, those are just stories that you're telling yourself. Like, why don't you just pause and move away from this, self righteousness of everything is about you, and how do you create a space to recognize that all of us are experiencing life and going through challenges at life, and we could all use a little bit of kindness and generosity.
Yes, and self-compassion, which you also write about. Um, what is one of your favorite mantras that you recite daily?
Oh my gosh. I actually have so many of them right in front of me. My favorite one that I've said this for years. This was even before I wrote the book. Is that change is possible. Um, for me, that's one that keeps me doing the work that I'm doing, because there's just so many obstacles that get placed in front of you, and when you get a no, um, immediately you're like, oh my gosh, I'm never going to be able to get this. And so for me, I'm always reminded, I was like, change is possible. Like, how do I
Mhm.
look at this differently? What was I missing in how I presented this? How could I have positioned this differently?
Yeah.
How do I need to socialize this differently, right? Or
Mm.
am I actually in the right direction, right? Could I be potentially wrong? And
Right.
what does change, what should change look like? So for me,
Mhm.
it's that constant reminder, change is possible. It's what allows me to put one foot in front of the other, and remind myself that I'm here to drive change that is positive, but not
Mm.
always the change that I think is necessary.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, I'm a huge fan of self-affirmations and mantras and, ways to self-talk.
Yes.
And one of my favorites is all I need is within me now.
Oh,
It
yes,
just
yes.
reminds me of that agency, and I really think that that is, like, a great way to encapsulate your book, is it just to remind people that they have a role, a very significant role to play in their own joy and
Mhm.
agency and the direction of their lives and the ways that they manage through turbulent times, like experiencing burnout. So, just love to hear you close us out with some practical things that could speak to those who are listening and saying, I hear it and I appreciate that this book is coming and I'm going to read it. But in this short term, I'm just feeling this pressure and pain. What can I do?
Yeah. I mean, like I said earlier, the first thing to do is to, um, you can call it a self audit, right? I call it, self
Mm,
reflection. Really dig deep into not the things that are happening to you, but why are you responding to the things that are happening to you the way you do, right? Why do you say yes to everything, right? Why do you feel regret the minute you say yes to something, right? Like
mm,
those are, we don't spend enough time really dissecting that piece, and we spend a lot of time, like I said earlier, right? Like, we like the cute phrases and quotes, and it's like, and I became such a fan of mantras while writing this book, and I have always had, I really have in front of me, like, I mean, it's how many, they're 44. They're mostly questions that I ask myself during the day of, like, is what I'm doing generative, is it nourishing, is it restful, right? Is it,
mm,
is this the highest and best use of my time, right? Like that, those
mhm,
those are my mantras, are very reflective on, based on questions. And so I would encourage you to ask yourself the questions that, are most impactful to the moment that you're in, right? I ask myself sometimes, right, how can I be a more effective leader? My favorite question to ask myself is, how do I show up as my best self despite what's been handed to me?
hmm.
Right? It's not just showing up as your best self, but it's despite the things that are being handed to me, how do I still show up as my
Anyway,
best self?
yeah.
Right? And the answers will come to you. And the other thing I will say, because there's a lot of conversation around boundaries,
Mm,
and establishing healthy boundaries tells the world that you matter. And so that boundary setting piece is, right now, is where a lot of organizations are struggling, because leaders are struggling with how much do they ask of their teams without burning them out and exhausting them. Employees are sometimes just saying outright no, right? Like, this is right. I'm not going to do it. I don't work on weekends. I don't work after 5. Like, all of these things, and what we haven't done is get to a place of shared understanding where we can actually talk to each other and recognize. I was like, you know what, I'm going to ask a little bit more of you today, and then tomorrow, I'll slow it down a little bit because this is the deadline, but also because I don't have anybody else that can do what you can do. But together, right? And these are um, the scripts that I offer throughout the book is how do we talk to each other? The scripts that I offer are from a manager and also from an employee, right? Because we need to learn how to talk to each other, right? So how do we ask each other the questions that don't push us away from each other, but that actually bring us closer? So you can actually say, hey, Shannon, I know that this project is going to require an extra 10 to 15 hours this week. And, and I have the flexibility this week, but next week, my son or my daughter has XYZ. So I'm going to ask that, can I get some flexibility next week? Because I'm going to show up for you this week and I'm going to do that, right? Like, how do we have that conversation instead of saying, no, I never do that because I want to make sure that, I have boundaries and I have to take care of my family. It's understanding that we're a team and that
Yeah.
we play different parts, and sometimes you're in front of the room, sometimes you're in back of the room, and how do you lead that dance in a thoughtful way so that nobody burns out, right? It's not just about you
Mhm.
safeguarding your burnout, but it's also about safeguarding the collective health of your team.
Mm, yes. And you talk a lot about like leading by example. And
Mhm,
I think that's exactly what you're saying. Leading by example. Like even despite these circumstances, I can still be my best self. I can
mhm,
still be thoughtful. I could give myself the space and grace that I need just to collect myself if I'm really in the grip of something.
mhm,
And the way you're describing that is just so impactful. So here's a couple of things that I heard you say that I think people can apply to their own work and lives. You talked about recognizing burnout and knowing what it is and what it isn't. I think it's really healthy to start out with a kind of shared understanding of what are we talking about here. And it's not just the day-to-day tensions, it's really this excessive workload
yeah,
and that monster. You talked about recharging your social battery, your daughter's quote, and just, for all of us, like there's a different tolerance for all of these demands on us. For some people, like they're kind of energized by all of this energy and frenetic situations, but
mhm,
for others, it's just exhausting.
yeah,
So, like, where are you at, and how quickly is your battery
mhm,
depleting, and how do you recharge that? Establishing boundaries, and you've just reiterated that. Finding joy in that ikigai model is so impactful, and just knowing really like who you are and what brings you joy and how might that be of service to the world, coming back to yourself.
yeah,
And then the mantras for self-compassion and the mantras for like in the moment you're in, what can help you, what question can you ask? I love how practical that is that you share, Daisy. Like, what is the question that can get your brain back into a direction that can get you somewhere productive,
yes.
while still recognizing that whatever you're going through is challenging. Anything else you would add to that, Daisy?
Oh goodness, my one of the chapters at the end of the book is called Right Within, right? Because I really don't, I really fundamentally believe that we have, as managers and leaders, we have such an outsized impact on the people that we lead and the people that we interact with, and even as individual contributors, as colleagues. And when we are right within, we can give our best to everybody. And so my last, the what I'd like to close with is just, when we take care of ourselves, we can actually take care of others better. So take care of you, be kind and good to you, and that generosity will expand to others around you.
Oh my gosh, that's so beautiful. So, everyone, please pre order your book. It's released on September 18th. From Burned Out to Lit Up: How to Reignite the Joy of Leading People. There'll be links in the show notes, both to Daisy's website and to how to pre order your book. So, enjoy it. Daisy, thank you for being the light that you are. We are so enjoying your radiance, and we just love how generous you are.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for leading these important conversations and for having me join.